So let's move on to something like a sphere. I'm going to change my object to the sphere. And you know what? What would happen if I used the same tools that I used just a second ago on my cube here? What if I was going to use the planar map on this thing? So I'm going to go to UV projection tool first, and I'm going to just apply this. Well, I see a sphere here, and that's fine. If sometimes you actually need to do that depending on on a job. But in this case, what I really want to do is I want to make sure that this sphere is unwrapped in a way where I can paint on this object in 2D or bake out certain details in 3D even and transfer that onto a 2D map. Well, regardless of which axis I choose, I still get a sphere in here. And if I, for example, click on M to assign a material to this, you're going to start seeing that, yeah, I mean, sure, but it looks perfect from this view, but not so much, because if it's perfectly fine in this view, and, sometimes when you're doing things like camera mapping, I mean, all it really is just pretty much, mapping from one direction. You're throwing rays out, and you're baking or throwing a texture map onto a series of objects, so you have a limited amount of movement that you can view your object from. But as soon as you change your angle, then all of a sudden you start to see all these distortions. Well, what if I was going to see my object from here, or even try to paint a happy face on here, on my 2D texture map here? Well, then it would be kind of difficult. So if I go over to my paint again, and I start painting on this texture, and I'm going to change my color to something darker so it's easier to spot. Well, what if I'm going to, want to paint a happy face? It's visible from this point of view, sure. What happens here? Yeah, that doesn't really work, does it? Not so much. And it really gets kind of tough, especially in areas like that. You start getting repetitions, there's a bit of distortion here. And the closer you work your way to the side, the harder it is. So let's go back into my UV view again. And let's reproject that to a different projection altogether. Now you have a distortion from this angle, and and then again from this angle. What you really want is to make sure that all these polygons on this entire object are more or less, you can see all these squares across the entire model and nothing like this. Because especially around areas like this, you see a lot of stretching and mirroring, and this is not what you want. So planar does not work in this case. So what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to use UV projection tool and change the projection type to spherical in this case. And what's going to happen is your result is going to be somewhat better. You are going to have to change some of the settings because the actual poles of this sphere are on the top and bottom, and of course my axis is towards the Z, so it's thinking that the poles are of course along the Z, and that's not the case. So I'm going to go on Y, and all of a sudden you notice that this texture map, or the UVs along my UV view, are now all of a sudden all square, all very nicely laid out. And for the most part, this texture is okay. Granted, of course, what happens here is, considering the sphere, the edges of these polygons get shorter towards the poles and longer towards the midsection, towards the anyways, so what happens is these polygons themselves are not uniform perfectly. But of course, the way they're laid out here in the UV view are perfectly square. So this is okay. It's going to give me a very predictable kind of paint. When I paint from here to here, I'm going to get very nice streaks along the sphere. But usually when you're UVing or when you're going to want to work in Photoshop, you want, again, a predictable result. So what you really want to do is you want to flatten your object out so that you can have a very stabilized result. So that when you do end up, for example, even painting in 3D instead of just 2D, you have a UV map that's very stabilized, and for the most part, you don't have things like, these squiggly lines. Now, if I was going to subdivide my model right now by pressing Tab on my keyboard, for the most part, it does stabilize somewhat. The more subdivisions I have, the cleaner my UV map appears. But still, what happens here is not cool. So in these kind of cases, what I like to do is I like to just select these polygons here, for example, like that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Projection Tool again. And in this case, I'm going to go back to Planar and along the Y-axis. And I'm going to move that out of the way. Now what this gives me is it gives me, for the most part, a good UV layout across a large majority of the sphere and a very flat result towards the top. So if I'm going to paint now in 3D, like that. If I'm going to paint now here's one thing that you should know about Modo. In order to paint in 3D to any part of the object, the UVs have to be within the 0 to 1 range. So one quick way of laying out these UVs to make sure everything's nicely organized is, again, going back to UV, pack UVs, and do that. So now these squares are pretty much identical in size to these ones, which might or might not be what you want. So I'm just going to scale these down slightly, move them over closer to the border, like that. And now I'm going to take this and I'm going to actually scale it up. And when you really do this, you really should be working without any form of subdivision, because sometimes your models might shrink a lot towards the borders. Sometimes not so much, but sometimes it happens. So I'm just going to scale that up uniformly like that, just to make sure I fill in more space on the UV map. And you might have noticed that, of course, this is nicely readable from left to right. This, not so much. So what I'm going to do again is flip it over. That's not giving me a result I want, so I'm just going to manually scale it. And when I do that, again, in the properties, I want to make sure that I scale it by -100. Or I could be using mirror. Either or works. Again, from left to right, very readable. And I'm going to go back into my paint. And I'm going to subdivide my object, and I'm going to paint across this. Now my UV map is, it's got seams. That's fine. As long as my result that I see here is clean, it's all good. So when you paint in 3D, it's clean. When I try to paint on the bottom, however, I'm not sure of the result that I'm going to get. So I'm going to try to paint across here. And you start to notice that it actually starts to break apart. There's a lot of seams here. And again, it starts to break apart towards the bottom. Now this is why I urge everyone, whenever they do these kind of UVs, that they do this and they UV that section of the model and make sure that as much of the model is flat as possible. So again, I'm just going to pack UVs and I'm going to try to fill in more space with this. I'm going to move that slightly down. And now when I try to go back to paint again, and I paint on this, or even paint like this, it's all predictable. And again, if I try to do it from the top here, even from the top here, it's very predictable. I know exactly what I'm going to get. So whenever you're giving your artists, whenever you're going to be UVing a model, try to make sure that as much of the model is flat as possible. As in, very nicely organized in the UV map, and that you never really have, the case of too many polygons coming together and, starting to deform and lose, once you start seeing any kind of artifacting in your UVs, then you know that something's going wrong. So that is the sphere. Next up is the cylinder. Now, one thing that you might want to keep in mind with the cylinder, and you're going to see this very soon, is if I go down to my UV projection tool once again, and I go to cylindrical, and I apply it to my cylinder, the result is not exactly what I wanted just yet, and I'm going to try to reapply it, and I get something like that. And this is actually pretty good. This is kind of what I expected. But one thing to keep in mind is that cylindrical mapping only goes around the cylinder. If I apply a texture right now, or my material, you'll notice that again the top and bottom, or both ends or both caps of this texture or model are not really UV mapped. I mean, they are. It happens from here to here. Last polygon is left intact, or left alone. Same thing here. So what this did is it didn't consider the mapping of these, and it just kind of left it alone. So for the majority of this is okay. Now, another thing you might have noticed is that whenever I use any kind of UV projection, and I think I might have mentioned this earlier, is that it will always try to fill in as much of the 0 to 1 space on this texture map. This is good and bad. The reason why it's bad is because, well, right now if I look at this, I mean, sure, I can read from left to right, and that's fine, but the squares are not very squarey. They're more rectangular. They're more rectangle in shape. So I'm going to now have to resize. I'm going to have to go to scale. I'm going to have to scale down the UVs until, of course, the shape that I get here is more square-like. And I might have to square it down a tiny bit more. Of course, you start seeing that these polygons here have not been mapped, and the result here is not so nice. So what I'm going to have to do now is, again, do the same thing that I did for sphere. Projection tool. This time planar, because I'm going to be, mapping this cylinder along the Z, or the caps, my selected polygons only. I'm going to click that, and that's okay. Of course, I have both of these selected, but I don't have to actually worry about this, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to, considering this polygon is not really connected to this, even though they're on top of each other in the UV view, they're not connected on the actual model. And considering they have been mapped separately from this, the UVs are already disconnected anyways. So I don't have to worry about the next step, which is I'm going to go again to pack, orient, and I get something like this. And now the majority of my model is mapped. Or actually the entirety of my model is mapped. So I'm going to try to again press flip. That didn't really work how I expected. I'm going to try to mirror along the U. That worked just fine. And this is just fine. So this model has now been mapped. Now, if you want, a lot of artists, what they will do is they will often do things like, they'll connect these two polygons over to the, to this object or to this portion of the model. Now, there's an upside and downside to that. One of the upsides is that you at least have one way. Now, if I, for example, select the edge selection here, and I click anywhere on here, on this polygon, you'll notice that there's if I actually take off the show image, you'll notice that if I select any one of these edges, that I get a blue edge selection here. What this means is that it shows me the connected edge on the actual polygon. So even though the UVs have been split, it's showing me the connection, the physical connection on the actual model. So this edge is connected to this edge here on the real model. So what I might want to do is I might want to rotate this like that. and maybe a little bit more. Like that. Move it down. And of course, connect it to here. Now the size of this polygon, or this edge, is slightly different than here. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to move it as close as I can to there. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on scale. I'm going to click on as close as I can to this corner. I'm going to move my viewport away to here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to scale this polygon. Of course, it's going to scale from this point that I just left clicked on. I'm going to hold Control on my keyboard, and I'm going to, actually before I do that, I'm going to press on this button here. And now if you notice the yellow pop-up, it says 0 means independent. That means this slider and this value are separate. So if I change them, you'll notice that, one is changing to 50, the other one is staying. If I click on this once, that means that if I change one of these, both of them will change, and so on. So what I want is I want to click on this so that this polygon is scaled on 2 axes. And already I really shouldn't have done it quite like that. Anyways, I'm going to move this down again because I scaled it down and it left it alone. Or it gave me the wrong result here. Okay, so once again I'm going to left click my scale tool, and then I'm going to left click on here on my property. I'm going to press and hold Control, and the reason why I want to hold Control is because if I just left click here and drag, I'm going to get a scale like this, which for the most part is okay. But sometimes when you're working with really, if you want to be really accurate about things, you might want to hold Control. And if you'll notice that right now, if I don't hold Control and I just left click, my values over here are changing by 0.5 for the most part. Right? Now, if I do this again, and if I press equal here and press Control and left click, you'll notice that my values that I'm changing at are much smaller. The increments are much smaller, and I'm able to get a lot more accuracy to my scale. Now, of course, now that this is very close together, I have 2 ways of joining it. One, I can select these vertices and I can click these buttons here. Up and left usually will snap these points together. Or I can select this edge, which will in fact select both the connected edges of, both that and that. So what I want to do is select these, and I want to go to, with options, move and sew, by the way. So this is the tool, and these are the different ways in which it can be used. So with options, I just want to use sew. Average is okay, and like that. So now what I get is, if I move this part of my object over, you'll notice that this paint right here carries over nicely to there. So if I was going to go over to paint again, and I was going to choose my paintbrush and start painting across this part of the texture, and I'm going to go once again I'm going to go to image options here, show image, and I'm going to paint a happy face on here. You start to notice that it is in fact painting right across from there. Of course, what happens is here, there's a nice corner here, and of course, I'm painting across for the most part, but if I start using tools like baking, there's usually a certain amount that, of bleed that you're going to get across these edges. That's outside of this topic, but there is a reason why sometimes you might want to keep these polygons separate and not always together. But anyways, that is how you match, these caps, for example, to a piece that's been separate. So what you really want to do again is try to fill. If I go back to my UV view again, I'm going to go to Pack, Orient, and I'm trying, and again, pack will always make sure that the way these squares get shown is always the same across the entirety of this model. The scale of everything is proportional to itself, to, you know, to the area around it. So next up is going to be this right here. And I'm going to be using yet another tool.